talked a little bit about how we can get that clean data from a business process perspective by making sure that we're asking reps questions, using automations and systems to parse the answers to those questions and make decisions about things like booking types and all of that. But that isn't necessarily sufficient. That gets you part of the way there. The reality is that a business with all of its nuances and decisions and things like that is a living, breathing organism that has a very analog style instincts, right? Everything doesn't fit neatly into a validation rule or some sort of structure. So in order to get to a world with really clean data, you actually need a multi-pronged defense strategy. So one is around process, which we just talked about. The other one is around observability and making sure that your CRM doesn't become this system that has a million validation rules in it, such that every time your reps try to move a little bit, they feel like they're in a straitjacket. Because that's no good either. So, but you still need to make sure that data is consistent and looks the way it's supposed to look. So in our CRM, we actually use precious few validation rules. There's probably 4 or 5, I would say, on the account and on the opportunity objects primarily. And they're for things that absolutely cannot ever go wrong. And they fire almost never. So they're really just like, kind of traffic stoppers, if you will. The way that I maintain really clean data looking across the organization has to do with a testing infrastructure that I built a couple of years ago after I just got really frustrated with generally it was cross-object stuff that was inconsistent or even within the same object. And I just didn't want to go down the validation rule path. So the testing infrastructure is fairly straightforward. It is a set of several hundred SQL queries that are all declarations about our environment. They run in our data warehouse, and they run against a replica of our Salesforce database that we dump into the data warehouse like most people do. And they look for things that might go wrong. And they're things that could be really tiny, like there is a missing piece of data somewhere that there really should be, or maybe an inconsistency, like we're saying an opportunity belongs to the mid-market segment, but it's currently owned by an enterprise rep. That's the sort of thing that it's a yellow flag. It might be wrong. It might also just be an exception that we made because we decided to make an exception that day for whatever reason. But it looks a little strange and it looks a little funny, and we should talk about it. So there are 2 key parts to this. Assuming you have an analytics team that can get that read replica going in your data warehouse and a DBT project. And inside our DBT repo, like I said, we have several hundred declarations that all say something about how our business should function. So as an example right now, this declaration makes sure that the owner of the opportunity, their attribution that's on that opportunity, that they are in the sales team and they're on the account executive sub-team and they're on the enterprise sub-team, matches what is actually written in the object. This allows me to go and observe when there are problems. Maybe there are issues with our automations or whatever it is, but without bothering the reps, right? Without creating a validation rule that stops them in their tracks. It also allows me to move a lot faster. One thing that a lot of organizations do, and it's become an increasing trend inside of Salesforce development, is actually developing directly in production. And Salesforce's product has actually pushed us in this direction by creating better debugging tools in production, in Salesforce Flow and in other things, because they realize that you can move a lot faster than if you have multiple layers of sandboxes and deployments and things like that. All of that is still very powerful and very useful for very large organizations that have to coordinate. But if you are several hundred employees and you have a business that's still very fast growing, this sort of thing can be huge because it means I can move faster without having to test every little thing, knowing that my testing infrastructure is going to tell me when something goes wrong. And will let me know if it basically will be the set of indicator lights that will go off flashing. And so it tells me if I broke something. Again, not something I would advise if you are working at a publicly traded company or some sort of much larger organization. But for a fast growing startup, I think that's the right agility trade-off. So all of these tests run every couple of hours against our organization. And then once we've got those running, we actualize them inside of this Retool app that is we call it our data testing app. And what this lets us do is this lets us look and see by object opportunity, account, etc. What's wrong? So you'll see these are the results of these tests. And these are all things that I have to look through and fix. These are inconsistencies with some of our finances. This is telling me that we have a one deal that hasn't been marked as signed in our CPQ solution, etc. Now, these are all, like I said, yellow flags. Sometimes they're red flags, and I address them right away. And once I do, I can click on the record, open it, investigate. Okay, great. I took care of it. The Retool dashboard now writes back the fact that I took care of it, and it snoozes the record. This is all captured in a custom object in Salesforce. Sometimes I want to say, you know what? Yes, this rep went to EMEA for March. And so what I might do is I might go and say, I'm going to snooze this until, this date. Great. And then this test will not show up again, or this failure will not show up again until that snooze date. So I can say, hey, I just want to put this on ice for a while, and I can go and review those and see all of those exceptions. This has saved probably 2 or 3 headcounts in my organization by making sure that I always have somebody, being the testing infrastructure, looking over the data and making sure everything looks consistent.
When you say this has saved headcount, you mean that for some people to manually go and review all of this data, it would be like 2 or 3 full-time people. Is that what you're saying?
It would be both 2 or 3 full-time people. And I think about the fire drills and the fire alarms saved when things break and we have to, basically rally all the troops to get some data together for a board meeting or something like that, because things break at inopportune times. We don't have those problems because we monitor things constantly. So we make sure that things are always ready to be analyzed and looked at. And I mean, you can see this is anonymized, but it's live data. We do have issues in our stack right now, but they are manageable and muted and things that we will handle. And a lot of these are actually things that are, pending project work that we're doing to make sure that they get fixed. So they're within acceptable tolerances.
So let's say I'm maybe I'm on the revenue operations team. Maybe I'm a Salesforce administrator. I'm a little earlier in my career. I see this and like, oh, wow, that's really valuable. Clearly, we should have that at my company. How would I go about recreating this? And I mean, like, what skills do I need to learn in order to do this? You mentioned DBT. You mentioned the data warehouse. Like, how would you advise someone who doesn't know how to do any of this stuff on where to get started and how to end up at this place?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the technologies that we just talked about make this process simpler and easier. But at their heart, all we're doing is running a bunch of SQL queries. And those SQL queries return results if something's wrong and don't return results if nothing's wrong. So if you can work with your data team or even if you can get a data warehouse stood up, which is not that hard to do these days, like Amazon Redshift or something like that, buy something like Stitch or Fivetran off the shelf, also pretty easy to do, to dump your Salesforce data directly into it. Then it's just a matter of running these queries. Every single one of the tools I just mentioned has the ability to schedule running SQL queries. So you run them and you get an output and you look at it. That's all this is at the end of the day. A lot of this stuff, like the app that we're staring at right now, this is workflow management, right? This is taking that output and giving me the ability to say, I addressed this problem, I didn't address this problem, like that sort of thing. This is, in my mind, how this sort of infrastructure becomes collaborative, how it becomes auditable, and all of that. But at its core, it's really that. And if you really, really want to bake this down to its core, it's downloading data into, Google Sheets and doing some VLOOKUPs and writing some formulas and making sure things match.
Yeah. But your point, I think the broader point is, this is a job that's easier to do outside of Salesforce, rather than, in particular, imposing validation rules in Salesforce. So the key insight here is, you've chosen to evaluate data after it has already been produced so that it is lower friction to reps, rather than putting a bunch of blockers in front of them by having a validation rule on every single one of these things. And then you can go and address these things at some later date, based on how important they actually are. And like you said, in some cases, there will be exceptions. So you'll want to handle those manually. You don't necessarily want to have the validation rule because you will have exceptions here and there.
That's exactly right. I think each of the things that we're talking about here, whether they're validation rules or analyzing your data after the fact, or even other tools in Salesforce like dependent pick lists is a form of data validation. All of these things should be tools in a modern RevOps person's toolkit, and we should apply them in very different ways.